Hello and welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. And today we're picking up again on the theme of sustainability and environmental and social governance, which is a topic we first picked up actually in our podcast with Thomas Udderson, one of the founding members of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. And we know from feedback from listeners, it's an area of considerable interest for people. So really excited actually to say that in today's conversation, I'm joined by one of the most esteemed and respected thinkers in this field, namely Professor Paul Ekins OBE. Paul is Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at the University College London and is frankly a man with so many achievements in the area of sustainable economics. It's very difficult to distill them down into the introduction to a podcast, but I shall nonetheless try. So in addition to a myriad of considerable academic achievements, he's been co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre, member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, specialist advisor to the Environmental Audit Committee of the House and Commons, member of the European Commission's panel on European decarbonisation, Global 500 Award for Outstanding Environmental Achievement, and of course in 2015 was awarded an OBE New Year's Honours List for his service to environmental policy. So Paul, thank you so much. We're delighted that you could join us for this conversation today. You are a man that has a huge amount of knowledge and experience on this topic of environmental economics generally. I'm just interested to start by what initially drew you to this area and where your kind of passion and interest in this topic comes from.
Yeah, well, we go back a long way. It was in the 1970s. I had a first degree in electrical engineering, but I then spent a bit of time being a classical singer, actually, and I made a living at that.
Wow.
For about 10 years. Not a brilliant living, I have to say. And by the time I got towards my 30s, it was clear that I needed a career change, and I'd been bitten by environmental stuff. It was perfectly clear to me at that time that the way we were using the environment was literally unsustainable, meaning that it couldn't go on indefinitely. I read a number of really important books. I suppose the books of someone who we don't hear much about now was particularly important, a man called Fritz Schumacher. He was an economist, and he wrote the book Small is Beautiful, which was really important, and lots of other books too, which were my introductions to economics, I guess. He was a mainstream economist. He was chief economist at the National Coal Board, which still existed at the time, of course doesn't anymore. Ironic really that as a man in the coal industry, which we now regard as the epitome of unsustainability, he had come to all these conclusions. When I felt it was time for a career change, I went briefly into the Green Party. I was its general secretary. It was called the Ecology Party in those days, but I'm a lousy politician. I have huge respect for politicians when they're
Why are you a lousy politician, Paul?
Well, because I was much more interested in getting my views across than listening to other people. Politicians have to listen to other people. I still think politics is the highest human art, and when we get it wrong, as we frequently are doing now, our societies get into really big trouble. You know, people talk about the post-truth age, that politicians seem prepared to lie much more often than they did. And to get away with it. I find that very regrettable because to me, as a scientist, really trying to understand the world as it is and represent it faithfully to people is the highest imperative if we want to make any progress towards environmental sustainability. Because this stuff is not easy, it's difficult, and it's something that we need really to be honest about.
So can I take from that, Paul, the start of your journey was political in the sense of using that forum and that platform to, I assume, drive focus on this agenda. You moved away from that into academics?
Having discovered that I wasn't a good politician, I came to the conclusion that it was the economy stupid. So it's economic activity that's screwing up the world we live in and the way we do that. And I wanted to understand why. So I went back to university, got a master's and a PhD in economics. And the PhD was all about are economic growth and environmental sustainability consistent with each other? That's a debate that started in the 70s and it's still rumbling on. I published my PhD as a book in 2000. I came to the conclusion that it could be compatible under strict conditions. And so since then, my academic quest has been to say, who needs to do what to make it compatible? We're not doing that yet. So at the moment, economic growth is still extremely environmentally disruptive, but it doesn't have to be. All my efforts are towards thinking about who needs to do what in terms of government, in terms of business, in terms of citizens, in order to achieve the standard of living that we want to achieve, but at a tiny fraction of the environmental burden.
And your premise is that both are compatible, so you can have economic growth with a sustainable outcome.
In theory, that is certainly possible, and we've proved it in respect of certain environmental issues. For example, sulfur dioxide emissions in the UK. They're much, much, much lower than they were in the 1980s when we were worried about acid rain and all those kinds of things. And yet the economy's kept on growing. Actually, in the UK, in respect of carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases, they have gone down, even if you calculate them on a consumption basis, which is a bit techie. Even if you take account of all the emissions from our imports, which is what the consumption basis is, yes, they have gone down since about 2007, while the economy has kept on growing. Not much, because we've been hit by two huge shocks, the financial crash in 2008, and then obviously most recently the pandemic. But there's enough evidence there for me to believe that it is possible if that's what we really want to do. My main criticism is that when I look at what government does, and when I look at what business is doing, I can see that they don't really want to do it. And under those circumstances, it's not surprising that we haven't yet done it to the extent that we need to.
Understood. What's your view on how we do affect change then? If, in your words, government isn't doing it and business isn't doing it?
Well, I have the long view on this. So I've been doing this for quite a long time, 30 years, and we're certainly in a much better place now than we were then in terms of awareness of the issues, in terms of willingness to do something about it. The very fact I'm having this conversation with you to an audience principally of business people who I know are increasingly concerned about these issues is evidence that we've come a long way. Unfortunately, the planet is also in a much, much worse state in its ability to support us. And so the science is getting worse faster than we are getting better. And that's the race that we have got to accelerate on our end in order to catch up. I mean, the important thing is that people actually take the environmental crisis seriously. One of the main things I've learned from COVID is that when government is convinced there's a real emergency, it does stuff like it locks us down. You won't need to lock us down to do something about the climate, but you'll certainly need to direct far more of the kind of economic recovery package that we have in prospect towards a green recovery than we are currently doing. Yeah. And if the government really believed there was an environmental crisis, it would not be spending some of the money on some of the things that it is spending on. For example, reduction in air passenger duty. That is clearly not helpful from an emissions point of view. For example, thinking of opening a new coal mine in Cumbria. That is clearly not consistent and compatible with net zero ambitions. And is particularly regrettable this time when we're about to hold a major international meeting where we will be encouraging other countries not to open new coal mines.
Where do you put your faith in driving the change of this agenda? Is the answer in government or not?
The answer is everywhere. Government can't do stuff if citizens are not behind it, especially in a democratic society. I'm a passionate Democrat, so citizens have to support it. Again, why did the Chancellor not increase fuel duty in the most recent budget? We know there's a hole in the public finances. We know fuel duty would send the message that petrol and diesel is not good for the planet, but he didn't do it because he felt that it would be politically not popular. And so that's both a lack of courage on his side, but also getting messages from the media and the citizens that they're not going to support that stuff. So it's all of us. I'm increasingly drawn to the fact that business is doing more than I would have expected in a competitive capitalist environment, that there are many, many businesses now that are going way beyond regulation in order to address some of these issues. They're not doing enough, but that's partly because they are in a competitive environment and they're afraid that if they were to do much more, they would go bust. And of course, it's government's job to change the market conditions so that businesses that want to be sustainable can not only be sustainable, but can make money. And the businesses that won't be sustainable are not sustainable financially, as well as not being sustainable environmentally. And again, government isn't doing anything like enough to create the playing field under which sustainability can prosper.
Yeah. And you mentioned at the start talking about politics and the post-truth world and this rather frightening position where facts don't seem to stack up. That seems to be something that's impacting this agenda particularly. I mean, we've just come out of a world where the most powerful man in the United States effectively denied this topic or its importance. What's your view on that? Do you see that as an issue that's changing, or is that still something that we all need to tackle as well?
I think it's probably still going in the wrong direction. Obviously, I'm delighted that President Trump is no longer president President Trump, and that we now have a president who listens to scientists on the subject of climate change. I mean, the other big lesson from COVID to me is just how deep-rooted this denial of scientific reality seems to be.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that you can have people in the UK standing outside Derby Hospital, as the BBC showed us recently, saying that COVID doesn't exist, when inside Derby Hospital, there were nurses and doctors working 24 hours a day trying to stop people dying from COVID. I mean, this is mind-boggling. 200 years after supposedly the Enlightenment, people can't get their heads around this stuff.
Are you positive about the future, Paul? I mean, as you say, you've been looking at this topic for 30 years. I imagine over that time you've seen lots of ups and downs and new dawns and dark nights.
Well, I'm hugely concerned because we're not doing enough. All the data that matter. I mean, one of my big jobs over the last few years has been to co-chair the United Nations Global Environment Outlook, which is the most comprehensive statement about the state of the environment that you're likely to find. It's really scary stuff. And this is from 150, 200 scientists all over the world drawing together their knowledge. At the moment, we're not paying sufficient attention to that. But positivity, Simon, in my view, is more a state of mind. I mean, I want to get out of bed on Monday morning in the knowledge that I want to do stuff. And I know that I can do stuff, and there's a chance that some of the stuff I do will make a difference. And that's why I keep going. It's also, for an academic, is intellectually absolutely fascinating. One of my new initiatives, as we've talked about before, is I'm just setting up a new series of short courses for business people, actually get alongside this agenda and hopefully be really challenged in a positive way so that they think, oh yeah, get it now. And then they go back into their own organizations and their own businesses and they say, oh, wow, yeah, actually, I can do this stuff and we can continue to be profitable and we can continue to make these changes. But then if we want to go further than that, then government's got to get off its backside and do something too and help us. And we produced a big report just recently from something called the Green Innovation Policy Commission,
right,
which was co-chaired by a former director general of the CBI and had a lot of senior business people on it. And these were all business people who wanted to do more in the sustainability agenda.
Yep.
And so the report has two sets of recommendations. One is a challenge to their business colleagues to smell the coffee and get going. And the other is a challenge to government to provide the market conditions under which they can do this stuff and continue to remain in business.
In all of that work, Paul, you mentioned the big pressures. What do you see as the particularly big pressures as you see them at the moment?
Well, climate change is obviously a huge issue. And it's a huge issue, especially in this country, because we are the host of the big conference, the biggest conference since the Paris conference in 2015, which actually will enable us to see whether countries are serious about this agenda or whether it's all blah, blah. So that's very important. And that's where most of my own work is going to go over the next 6 or 8 months, really pulling together the work that we do at UCL in this area, have a big campaign about it. We're educators, so a lot of it is going to be explaining what the issues are, but there will also be policy briefs and all that stuff. The other agenda that's coming up very fast is the whole nature agenda, so biodiversity and just nature in general.
Paul, forgive me, you said the language now of kind of climate change and carbon is relatively, comparatively known, but the idea of biodiversity is perhaps not so much. Would you be able to just quickly summarize when you talk about that as an issue, what that really means?
As we know, there's something like 30 million species on this planet, including us. That number is very, very uncertain. It might be as little as 10. It might be even much more than 30. But anyway, let's stick with 30. And what we know is that we are currently undergoing what is called the 6th mass extinction episode. So if you look back in the fossil record, you can see that there have been times when very large numbers of species have disappeared. This is the first time it's happening because of the actions of one of those species, namely us. In the past, it's always happened because of changes in the climate, or the dinosaurs were wiped out when a meteorite hit Mexico, I think. This is the 6th time it's happened over, several billion years. So it's a pretty notable event. To be honest, we don't know what the implications of this are. We know that the biosphere is an extremely complex and interactive place where all these species have a role in maintaining the stability of life on Earth. And we know that there's a lot of redundancy. We can probably do without a lot of these species. there is natural extinction, which goes on.
Yeah.
Currently, the extinction rates are thought to be about 10,000 times higher than natural extinction rates in the fossil record. What we don't know is how much biodiversity we need in order for the biosphere to continue to function. It is therefore quite possible that, for example, when we destroy the Amazon rainforests, that suddenly that will do a flip such that the whole biosphere becomes much less habitable. And the planet is fine. The planet's got several billion more years with sunlight where it will continue on its way. The question is whether it will continue to do it with people and how many of those people it will be able to support. That's why that is of such concern. But there is huge uncertainty still about many of the parameters around that, except that obviously extinction is forever. And once we have crossed the threshold under which the biodiversity loss causes the biosphere to unravel, well, there's not going to be anything we can do about it. So there's no vaccine for climate change. There's no way of reversing biodiversity loss. These are irrevocable actions that will last for as long as the Earth lasts.
When people talk about an environmental emergency, it's not hyperbole. This is real and we're living it.
This is real and we're living it. And it's difficult for us to understand that and appreciate that because on a day-to-day basis, our lives go on and we all have the pressures of everyday life. We've got to get the kids to school. We've got to keep ourselves together. And it's very difficult to see that big picture. And of course, we're talking about these events happening in the long term. So climate change will work out what we've already done to the climate. Climate change will work out over the next few hundred years. Our political systems and indeed our whole mentalities are not set up to think of the next few hundred years. Well, politicians are famously focused on the next 5 years max. Many of our focuses are a much shorter timescale than that. So it's difficult for us to get our heads around those sorts of timescales. And so far, we've not really at all built the institutions that are able to take those into account and guide our actions so that these issues are given the weight that they deserve. Climate change is we're becoming more aware of it because we suddenly see wildfires that we never used to see. We see more frequent floods. We see more extreme storms actually happening now. But the problem with climate change is that if we wait until it becomes as obvious that there's a problem as COVID, for example, that's it. Then we've gone beyond the pale and the climate will do what it does, irrespective of anything we may try to do to change it. So we have to do what humans find really difficult, which is to be precautionary, not to do stuff because it might have a bad effect before actually it has had that bad effect. And humans are not good at that.
And then, Paul, so as we said, largely the listeners to this will be broadly business people. And just, is there a message you would leave them with in terms of this topic?
We are living at a very, very special time as humans. I guess all generations think that, actually. And I imagine people living through the Second World War and people living in, all the various stuff that was going on in Victorian times. We all think that we're living at a special generation. But this one really has the ability to ensure that human lives in the future are either civilized and livable, or, to quote the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, we go back to having lives that are nasty, brutish, and short. And so the stakes are very high indeed. If we do go back to a time when lives are nasty, brutish, and short, that's kind of the end of civilization, of the sorts of lives that we feel make life worth living. Humans have been there before, of course, but not because those sorts of lives have been imposed by outside circumstances, i.e. the climate or biodiversity loss or whatever it may have been. Generally, when we make life bad, we make it bad for ourselves. We have wars and all that stuff, or we don't care about poor people and they starve and whatever it may be. So these are kind of human-induced things. We're in danger of moving to a place where actually the Earth becomes a much less habitable place and cannot support anything like 9 billion of us. The transition that would make if lots of us were just to die, because we wouldn't die quietly. There would be mayhem, there would be wars, there would be migrations, there would be huge disruption and turbulence. And I'm fascinated when I look and see all the excitement that has recently been generated by this trip to Mars by this explorer from NASA. And so much effort going in. Has there ever been life on Mars? Can we find some grotty little bacteria sort of deep underground that have somehow managed to survive whatever happened on Mars that turned it from being a habitable place to being an uninhabitable place. And then I look what we're doing to our own planet, which is the most fabulous habitable place with all this wonderful biodiversity, and we're screwing it up and destroying it just as fast as we can go. And that is the ultimate irony, really.
It makes absolute sense. Paul, thank you so much for talking to me. We've spoken a few times. It's always fascinating to chat to you. And for people listening, obviously, that you mentioned the course that you're running at UCL. We'll put details on that. I'd strongly encourage people to look into it. I think there's some fascinating opportunities for businesses and business people to be part of that course with you. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and we really appreciate your time.
Great. Nice to talk to you too, Simon. Thank you for having me.